Hello students! Today we will be talking about Stanovich chapter 7. So we're powering through this book. We've talked about correlations, we've talked about experiments, we've talked about how to manipulate situations with experiments. So now we're going to talk about artificiality. So we've talked about this at the beginning of the Stanovich book, that some people will say, hey, with your psychology study, you have manipulated things to such a way that is a very artificial situation. You can't actually apply this to real life. So this is a really in-depth dive of that kind of criticism. So, with all sciences, scientists really deliberately set up conditions that are very unlike those that occur naturally. So when you want to see the effect of one variable on another variable, you might sometimes have to set up very specific kinds of environments to make sure you can see those kinds of behaviors, situations, interactions. So this is an example of a particle accelerator. So you've got some particles spinning around this at close to the speed of light, some particles spinning around this big tube. I forget how wide they are, or the circumference, but this is not quite a mile across, if I'm right. But basically, these little particles shooting around these little tubes and then crashing into each other in the middle over here, where they've got a bunch of very expensive sensors to see what happens when these particles crash into one another. So yes, that's a very deliberate artificial environment, right? So that's not a natural environment. In nature, will those particles sometimes interact? Absolutely. But we want to set up a situation where we see these particles interact with 100% certainty and control of all the other variables. So yes, sometimes we need natural environments, sometimes we need artificial environments. So we often deliberately, as scientists, we often deliberately set up conditions that allow us to separate the other confounding variables, the other covariating variables, the other correlated variables, to really pinpoint specific things that we want to look at. So it is difficult or even impossible in some cases to investigate natural phenomena in natural conditions in some cases. The particle accelerator is a perfect example of that. Looking at heroes is an example in psychology. So it is hard to just be there and be studying things when a heroic situation happens, when something is requiring heroism. So we could maybe set up a very staged manipulation where people aren't actually at risk, but they might feel like they're at risk and might have to take heroic action. So yeah, that's not a natural condition. That's not a natural environment. But we might have to investigate some phenomenon in those kinds of ways to get good answers. So control and comparison are very important. We talked a lot about control. We talked a lot about control groups, comparison groups in our chapter on experiments and control. Comparison groups can be different than a control group as well. And with that, with different groups, you can partial out the effects. You can partial out the effects of specific variables statistically using correlation and multiple regression, or experimentally by literally having different groups. So this allows the investigation of really specific aspects of the relationships. So the artificial setting can be made quite real, right? So it is a real thing that sometimes these particles do interact with each other somewhere out there in space, right? That does happen. A psychology example that I think is really interesting was one of the faculty who was teaching me research methods in grad school. So one of my mentors there was talking about a study they had done with the support of the US military. So they were looking at the interaction of teams in the Navy, or maybe it was the Air Force. One of the groups that does most of their work, a lot of their work on ships, they were looking at the interaction between the groups and how they made decisions and how they worked together in battle time. So what they did, because they had the immense funding of the US military for this study, they literally transformed a whole office room, a whole lab in a college. So on a college campus, one of the rooms was completely transformed, all the same exact computer equipment, all the same exact kind of devices. that were normally on the bridge of this ship were there. It might have been a submarine. So basically, there were no windows. It did not look like a normal room. It looked exactly like the same ship. These people who were on shore at this time, it looked exactly like the ship that they were on. So they made an artificial setting. These people who were part of this study, they drove from their homes or took buses or whatever, but they drove to a college campus. They went into an office. They did a consent form. They had like a little interview. So they knew they were part of a study. This wasn't like some random thing. They knew they were part of this study. Then they were taken to this room. Then they were presented with series of situations. So on the monitors, with the radar, with the information like the over the radio, all the things, all the instruments were telling them various things, giving them specific situations that they had to respond to based on their instruments. So this was a very artificial setting, completely made up, very controlled, but in doing it in such a way with all that money, they were able to make it so real life that these people, over the course of like 1.5 hour tests, felt and forgot that they were actually in this on a college campus. They felt like they were in the heat of a really intense battle. So you could think of it like a Star Trek holodeck kind of thing or simulation there. It was kind of like that. So it was a very artificial setting, but the reactions and the responses were very natural. They were actually what these people would have done in this kind of situation with life and death kind of responses to do. So with this, some variables, so one point here is sometimes you need to get that really specific detail. You need to get the specific relationships between these specific variables. You need to partial out everything else. So artificiality can be really good for that. Sometimes you can make your artificial environment so real that it's the exact same behaviors as you would see in a natural environment. Alternatively, some variables and phenomena will act the same way in an artificial and a natural setting. So depending on what you're researching, depending on what your research questions are, depending on what variables and phenomena you're looking at, you might be able to get a really good answer from an artificial setting or a natural setting. So remember the process of science. Remember that science is how we know what we know. So multiple studies answering similar and slightly different questions over time push us to what we know and our understanding. Study 1, you might have something qualitative and descriptive, just understanding how things are working. Study 2 might be entirely artificial, very contrived setting. Study 3 may take those same findings that you saw in study 1 and 2 and look at them in the real world. See, hey, is what we found, is that really what's happening in the real world? So any individual study might be very artificial, but it's within a system of studies. It builds our knowledge in things. And so yeah, it might answer a very, very specific question and be very, very artificial. And it in and of itself may or may not be supposed to be applied widely to the world. But science as a whole process, we are trying to apply things to the whole world, but any given specific study might not be trying to do that. So another artificiality criticism that we've talked about before are weird participants. So this is white, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. So a lot of samples in psychology, we've talked about a lot of these samples have been from the US. A lot of them are white, a lot of them are educated or more highly educated than average people around the world. More industrialized country, it's a richer country, a democratic country. So these differences might make the findings we see here with the weird participants different than what we might find in a country that is not white, for example. So college students are another example of a sample that we're critical of. College students aren't exactly the same as everybody else. The experience of going to college in and of itself is a pretty unique thing. On average, people in college tend to be like 17, 18 to about 24 or so. And so that's a particular age, right? So volunteers, who's volunteering for your study? Who's not volunteering? your samples might already be artificial in some ways that might color your results, and you need to be aware of that as a researcher. MTurk workers, I've mentioned a lot of my recent studies have been with MTurk workers. So how are they different than the general population? Well, one big difference is they clearly have access to the internet. They know enough about it that they feel comfortable doing online internet work. So are my grandparents going to be doing MTurk work? Absolutely not. So there's a whole big portion of the population that could not possibly be included in my studies. And so in some cases, this might be a critical limitation of your study. Or, depending on what you're studying, it might not be a limitation at all. So depending on your methods, depending on your measures, depending on your variables, it may or may not matter so much what your sample is. As an example, working memory is pretty standard. It's pretty kind of genetically tied of like how you can build capacities of working memory, but on average, people's working memory kind of follows the same kind of pattern of how many things you can hold in your working memory at any given time. So if we compared a white person in the US to a white person in India, compared to a person whose family moved to the US from India maybe 2 generations ago, to someone whose family has been living in India for multiple generations, when we're looking at working memory, those groups, and literally working memory capacity, those groups are probably not different enough to really have a concern about one sample versus the other. But for many measures, there's probably a lot of concerns, right? Very different culture, experience, context around them. So depending on what you're researching, you need to know what might or might not be affecting this. So in general, it's always better to have larger samples, be more representative, trying your best to be as representative of the population that you're intending to talk about. So if the population you want to talk about is all of Salt Lake Community College, represent all the students of Salt Lake Community College. If you want to talk about all of the US, represent every single person and type of person that lives in the United States. Right? If you want to talk about the sample of you want to have a picture of the world, that's going to be a really large sample to include some people from basically every group of people around the world. So larger samples tend to be better. They tend to be more representative. So the more representative your sample is, the less these artificiality criticisms apply to that specific study. All right, so with this, what is basic research? What is applied research? We've talked about this before. Basic research goes to, and this is kind of a funny place, a funny chapter to include this, but this is where the Stanovich book does it. So that's why it's kind of a shift in tone here. So basic research is really very exploratory research. You're explaining behaviors, you're getting knowledge for the sake of getting knowledge. Versus applied research is trying to look at behaviors within context. It often focuses on a specific problem or to modify specific behaviors. Versus with basic research, you might be talking about behaviors. This is what's happening around behaviors. This is when the behavior happens. Versus applied research, how do we stop that behavior from happening? Or how do we make that behavior happen more? Would be an example of an applied versus a basic research question. So, basic research really builds the community's knowledge about things. It's very often descriptive, so describing what's happening, versus prescriptive, not saying this is what should be done, it's saying this is how things are, essentially. It's often very focused on building theory and understanding and expanding theory. Its purpose is generally to modify and advance theories, to have a better understanding to describe or have the theory describe things better. So oftentimes for basic research questions, the researcher themselves, like you yourself, will come up with these questions, be like, I really want to understand this better. I'm going to do some studies to understand what's happening with this better. You're generally not having any kind of value judgments. You're just trying to learn about it. Oftentimes you'll do experiments with lots of control to get really nitty-gritty, like what exactly is happening, how are these variables correlated, what's causing what. Oftentimes lots of control, but not always. Oftentimes you'll be disseminating this information to journals and conferences. But here again, you're not trying to solve a problem, so it's not like you're going to be taking this and giving this necessarily to someone treating something. You're just building the knowledge, which might be very useful then for treating something, but right now that's not what you're trying to do. All right, so that is basic research. So basic research really focuses on building the knowledge base. So some example basic research questions are things like, how does a child process memories? What child temperaments exist? How should we characterize or categorize attachment styles? This isn't prescribing this attachment style is better. How do we get this attachment style? It's saying, what are the different attachment styles? What does cognitive development look like in 3-year-olds? How does empathy develop? See, that's not trying to make people have more empathy. This is just investigating. How does this happen? What is empathy? How does it develop? All right, so those are some good examples of some basic research questions. All right, so now some applied research. So applied is often very focused on application. It's focused on problems. Oftentimes it'll be focusing on solutions, finding or offering solutions. Oftentimes you are doing both describing things and prescribing things. So this is what's happening and this is what we should do about it. Questions often come from the researcher or from someone working on the problem. So how do we help young people do better at math, for example? It's often very context dependent. So looking at what are the contexts affecting it, how can the context improve or not improve? So with this, oftentimes we're applying basic research that already exists to these problems. It's informed by theory still, or it's driven by atheoretical social problems and questions. Maybe there's already a group trying to fight or change or fix this problem, and they're not doing it based on social psych theory or developmental psych theory. They have a practice that they're already doing, and you can see, hey, is that working? And then give some recommendations of things to change. So with this, you might be starting with a problem and use theory and research to solve that problem. So with applied research, it can and does build the cumulative knowledge base. You will often disseminate both to journals and conferences, but also to the people doing the applied work. So give your results, probably obviously make sure it's you're not identifying people in your results, but give the results to the people doing the work, the teachers, the policymakers, the everyday people, the people trying to solve this social problem. Be like, this one worked best, keep doing that. Or, hey, if you shift this way, maybe it'll work even better. But again, with doing this applied research, you should be working with those people. This is not a thing where you come from our ivory tower and say, hey, I know exactly how to fix all these problems, do X, Y, and Z, and then you're good. No, you work with them. You see why they're doing what they're doing, you measure it, and then you put things together and figure out what works best. So it's very, very connected to evaluation. It's very, very connected to policy changes. So being able to generalize the results is extremely important in applied research because the findings might be able to be applied immediately to real life situations. Maybe this club is doing this to impact the environment or something, and so maybe in another state, another group can do that exact same thing. So being able to generalize can be very useful. So example applied research questions are things like, what factors contribute to smaller achievement gap? So you might have heard of an achievement gap. What kind of factors can lessen that achievement gap? What type of pre-K leads to higher levels of school readiness? Figure out which ones are best. Maybe put more funding in those areas. What interventions improve memory in a 5-year-old? Maybe that's something you specifically want to work on. How can we increase empathy in 6-year-olds? So that's a more applied question. Like before, our basic question was, how does empathy work? Or how does empathy develop? Now we're asking, how can we specifically increase empathy in 6-year-olds? So while both of these types of research and researchers are important, the majority of research is designed to test or modify theories. So most research that happens generally is a little more on the basic side. Any given researcher might be more basic or applied. Any given study is going to be a little more basic or applied. It's really a spectrum. You've got like basic on one side, applied on one side. Any given study might be at any given point on that spectrum. So when I think about research, what I do is very applied research. Most of what I do is trying to solve problems using the basic research to make people more pro-social, give people more purpose, help people be more mindful. All these kinds of things are examples that I've shared in class, right? So I see a socially significant problem. I want more pro-sociality in the world. So I do some applied research. I use the theory and the basic research that's there. I collaborate with people in the community, people that are working on this problem, communities, teachers, things like that. And then with these studies, I then disseminate that to people. I might do evaluations and give it back to the nonprofits I work with. I might give recommendations to policymakers. I might put that information into journal articles. But this is a cycle of going through this, working with the community, working with people on the ground to solve these problems, and using what we know about social science, about psychology, about psychological science, developmental science. We can hopefully solve a lot of the problems and help solve a lot of the problems that exist. So here is a little quiz. Is this a basic research question or applied question? So pause the video, go over these questions, put in your own notes which ones are basic and which ones are applied, and in about 10 seconds I'll go to the next slide. All right, if you haven't paused, pause it now and do that. I'm going to go to the next slide. So these are, the blue ones are more of a basic question, the green ones are more of an applied question. So again, applied is more directly solving problems or about problems in context. Basic is more just general knowledge, trying to build understanding. All right, evaluation is a slightly different thing. It's very, very applied. It's focused on programs, so you might do a program evaluation. It's extremely context dependent, so you might have your questions come not from the researcher, but from the people doing the program. So does our thing work that our program is doing? So you're very prescriptive. As the researcher or the evaluator, you give a judgment. You say, hey, your A, B, and C are working, D is not working, don't do that. So with evaluation, there are some additional skills that you need to have in addition to basic or applied research. There's a lot more human relations. These are people that probably care about the problems and programs that they have. So you need to interact with them in an appropriate and respectful way, especially if something's not working. You need to be respectful about it. You need to know more about program evaluation, research methods specifically. Developmental evaluation is a good example. So evaluation is kind of its own area of research, but it's very, very closely connected with applied research. So evaluation, I would say, kind of fits on this spectrum right around here. Any given study might be an evaluation study that's very closely applied research, or it might be a very basic research study and is really not evaluation at all. Or you can have evaluation that really isn't intended to build the knowledge base, but just answer a question for that client. So this is kind of where evaluation falls there, but it's an important part of research. Very often a study or research program will not be intended to be applied. And so while we have this nice discussion of like, this is basic, this is applied, a lot of the things we learn in basic research later becomes applied. We try to build something off that or solve some problem based on what we now know in basic research. So the later researchers might realize, hey, this is really useful to apply. In some ways, the determinant of is it basic research or applied research is time. So at one time it was basic, another time it's applied. So it's really a cycle. Basic, applied research, evaluation, they're all different ways that we use these tools of science to answer questions, to solve problems. So while we have these distinct definitions, they often work together. So again, here's this cycle. So you're doing evaluation, you're doing applied work, you're using basic work, you're putting things back into basic research. So this is how research probably should be working to solve problems. All right, well, that was kind of a shorter chapter, a little strange with a couple different topics in it, but hopefully you understand now a lot better how basic and applied research are different, and also how artificiality in experiments or situations may or may not be such a problem in sciences.